friends, go with me for a second. Back to the beginning of February, the 1st and 2nd of February in the year of our Lord 1959. All right. And we meet 10 hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, led by one Igor Dyatlov. And they set out on a pretty rough expedition into the Ural Mountains of Russia. And when I say this is rough, I'm like severely downplaying this. Like, I watched an episode of Expedition Unknown about this. Have you guys ever seen Expedition Unknown? I'm obsessed with it. I love Josh Gates with all of my heart. So I watched the 2-part episode of Expedition Unknown about the Dyatlov Pass, and getting there was like extremely treacherous. It's the middle of nowhere. It's super cold, like colder than Antarctica. That's how cold this is. And like even as they were getting there, the cameraman like flipped his snowmobile. It's like the winds are wicked high, and the foremost expert on the Dyatlov Pass incident had literally never even been there until she went with Josh Gates, because it's just not the kind of place you just go. Right?
Do we know what they were looking to get out of this? Because it doesn't sound like any kind of fun at all, even if they fucking lived. It went perfectly.
This feels like you know how people say, like, why do you climb Mount Everest? And the answer is because it's there.
I fucking hate that, man. Winds me the fuck up.
I think this particular instance, they were having a competition to see who's the most Russian, and whoever's the coldest is the most Russian.
Straight up. Yep. Yeah, I think that's actually a great
I have more toes remaining than you.
Yeah, really. The idea of Russian people just putting themselves through torture for fun is not something that is like hard for me to imagine. So these 10 students, they're making their way up on this extremely treacherous hike. One of them suffers from joint pain and turns back and ends up being one lucky son of a bitch, because we will never hear from the other 9 of them again. Which I kind of feel a kinship with this guy, because my joints suck, and I'm like, I would have survived the Dyatlov Pass incident as well. So there's that. So they're experienced hikers, but they're college kids. They're super young. And they all go up there, 7 guys, 2 girls, and they make their camp in a place called Kholat Syakhl, which translates in the indigenous Mansi language to dead mountain.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Of course, right? It's too on the nose. Like,
yeah, we all camp here.
So what we know for sure is that their tent was found half covered in snow and appeared to have been cut open from the inside. The hikers weren't in there, but all of their belongings were left behind. So we're talking like camp stoves, all of their clothes, all of everything, their backpacks, everything is still inside this, snow-covered tent that has been cut from the inside of it. And as the bodies were found over the next several months, they were found to have been in various states of undress. So some were just in socks, some had bare feet, some were wearing one shoe when they were found. They weren't wearing any of their cold weather gear. All of that stuff was still in the tents. They didn't even put on their jackets or anything. 2 of the bodies were found in their skivvies, just straight up in their underpants. Wow. Out in the snow. Of course, if you ever look at stuff about people freezing to death, there is that thing called paradoxical undressing, where people
you start to feel hot when you're in hypothermia.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you just start pulling stuff off.
Straight up. So that might be why these ones were completely naked, because they probably not completely naked, but in their underwear, because they probably weren't sleeping in their underwear. So this probably happened outside. There was evidence that including how the bodies were positioned and things like broken tree limbs, where it appeared that they might have climbed for a higher vantage point to look out, that they were probably trying to get back to their camp and succumb to hypothermia on their way back. So they fled for whatever reason, and then in trying to get back to their campsite, that's probably when they essentially froze to death.
Am I right in saying that the corpses were in various different stages of mutilation as well? Am I right in saying that they were quite badly fucked up?
Right. So some of them weren't that bad. The ones that were found, so first they found 2 bodies, and those were the ones who were in their underwear, and they died of hypothermia pretty straightforward. They found more bodies, again, who seemed to have died from hypothermia. They were kind of, the way that they were curled up was what indicated to them that they had been trying to go back. And they did find one had like a fracture to the skull, which some people say looked like it would have had to have happened from like getting hit with the butt of a rifle or something of that nature.
Nice.
But yeah, some form of skull fracture. And then months later, in May, they found the remaining 4 bodies. They were in a river and were like very injured. So these bodies had like crushed ribs, broken limbs, their fractured skulls, and 2 of the bodies one had its eyeballs were missing. And, yeah, right. Ooh, macabre. And then another, the tongue was missing.
Yes. Here we go.
Yeah, pretty gnarly discovery. And by the way, all of this, like, you can see these images on the internet. They even show them in the Josh Gates episode. Like, fully, you can see what these, you can see what these bodies looked like. It's the ones that were found months later. It's like they almost look like mummies. You know, they've just been there for months. So, and obviously, okay, so they've been under snow for several months here. The eyeballs and the tongue missing, pretty easily explained. There's bugs, there's animals. As they became more exposed, that's stuff that animals love to eat. They love a nice, like, tissuey, soft, something to pull out like an eyeball or a tongue. So it's likely that is what has happened. Oh, also tests showed later on that a couple of the bodies showed traces of radioactivity on them, which seems fairly suspicious.
Yeah.
However, in the Josh Gates episode, they did point out that the bodies that were found to have radioactivity on them, those 2 guys actually had worked around radioactivity in the past. So it's possible that that's why it was there. Also, people point out that the like lanterns that they carried with them used like thallium in them. And so that also might lead to radioactivity. So there's a few ways that you can explain that. The trauma of the other injuries seem pretty severe, though, especially as the result of an avalanche. So most of the time when someone dies in an avalanche, it's asphyxiation, right? You just suffocate. You either suffocate or you freeze. So having like your ribs crushed and stuff like that is not a normal thing that happens when you are hit by an avalanche. Now, this is a story that's kind of a lot like the Kennedy assassination in that like the government sort of covering up elements of it, like really banal elements of this. Right. Like the elements of that made more conspiracies than would probably have happened if they were like, well, here's actually what we found here. So some of the theories that have sort of been circulating about this ever since include that they were murdered by the Mansi people, the indigenous people. They were murdered by a prisoner who had escaped from a gulag. They were victims of some form of alien attack because in photographs that they found, there were like these like balls of light and whatnot, and it was just blackness and balls of light. However, also these cameras were found like in water after months.
Right, that's gonna probably have some effect.
You know, a little iffy there. Also that they got caught up in some form of government missile test, hence the radioactivity and the weird injuries. And even that they were, Bigfoot attack, because there was another picture of like one of the hikers that like kind of looked a little Bigfooty.
Yeah.
Soviet Bigfoot would fuck you right up, mate. Russian Bigfoot.
Right.
The most hardcore of all Sasquatches.
Yeah,
that's probably a theory I could sign on to. Bigfoot just stabbing a bunch of people
just for no reason, just
ripping out their eyes. Yeah,
just out of
sound like
spite.
a weird 80s horror movie.
Straight up, like I'm kind of for it. As a thing, I've watched plenty of bad sci-fi movies with similar premises, so I'm on board.
I've made my mind up.
It's officially Bigfoot.
Case closed.
Yeah,
he did it.
I'm not even gonna read any more of this story. We're good. Anyway, so Steve, nice to meet you. But another one is a disorienting phenomenon called infrasound, which is supposedly sort of a natural phenomenon that we don't know much about, but might have caused a disorienting thing that would have caused
I know
panic.
a little bit about this. My wife's brother lived in New Mexico, near where there are these sounds that only some people hear, and one of their sons heard them.
Really? What does it
Yeah.
sound like?
I have not asked him. He was a little kid, so he,
Oh,
not very
yeah.
descriptive. But
Right.
What is this naturally occurring?
apparently, just
Yeah.
look it up. I wish I had known these two might be connected. I would have looked it up so I'd have some more information. But yeah,
What do you
look it
call
up.
them, Corey?
Infrasound. Yeah, infrasound, infrasound. From kind of the description of it that I saw, it's like it's a disputed concept in and of itself, but supposedly could be created based on the shape of the mountain and the weather in the area. Supposedly there could be these sounds that would be wildly disorienting to people if they were to hear them. Now, they don't necessarily have evidence of, oh, go ahead, you have a thought.
Really briefly, infrasound is also the resonant frequency of the internal organs of the human body.
Oh,
Oh,
it's
And-
like hearing your insides.
Yeah. At high volumes, infrasound can directly affect the human central nervous system, causing disorientation, anxiety, panic, bowel spasms, nausea, vomiting, and eventually organ rupture or even death.
which
Sounds like an American pharmaceutical advert.
that is true.
Really,
So
infrasound
true.
might cause
There's just
vomiting.
someone hiking, like canoeing as it reads up all those.
Wasn't there a diplomat or something who died of suspected infrasound recently?
Wow.
I think you're right. And also
Yeah.
there was like all that stuff about, there were two different places, I think, where this was like an epidemic, right? Where there were, and they thought that it was a weapon of some sort.
Yeah.
That was being used to disorient people through sound, and they were all hearing this very strange.
I think this happened like pre-pandemic, so we haven't talked about it.
Yeah,
Other stuff.
We've got other stuff on our minds at this point, but I do remember various things related to sound that were potentially being used as weapons or whatever. It's interesting, the idea that it's the sound of your organs, because isn't that the thing that can kind of like, if you're in, they have those rooms, those chambers where there's no sound, and like if you're in them for more than a certain amount of time, they supposedly make you go crazy.
Well, there's the one train of thought is that there is no such thing as silence, because even when you're in one of those anechoic chambers, as they're known, you can still hear the whisper of your blood. You can still hear the rhythm
That's
of
the
your
thing
own
that gets
heartbeat.
me, the sound of your blood.
Yes.
Oh, that is
I
the
don't like
worst
that.
thing that I have ever heard. Like,
Ooh.
I just hate that so much.
I guess to pull on that thread,
Oh boy.
there's, I guess, a couple of seconds of perfect silence.
What?
You could die in one of those rooms, man. Just go in one of those rooms.
That's a good
and die.
point.
Huh.
That's like a
I
tree
guess
falling in the
so.
woods sort of situation, though. Like, would then your hair growing or something, like something is going to make, or the like gases in your body, or so.
As a death nerd, you know that that entices me. That concept of there being no silence other than the perfect silence of death. Metal as shit. I like that.
Yeah, that is. I wonder, because as you stop breathing, your blood starts to become acidic. I wonder if you would start to hear sizzling.
Oh God, dude, don't. Whoa. Now you're talking my language.
Oh, that is gnarly.
Like just a brief moment where your blood stops, then suddenly.
And this is a thing that we can literally never know, right? This is like that list of
like how would
which is the thing Mark loves, stuff that no one can know. But yeah, there's no way that we would ever know that, because you couldn't even like put a camera or something in there, because there'd be sound. Fascinating. So yeah, if I heard a sound that sounded like my internal organs, I'd probably get out of my tent and run. I feel like that's plausible, but there's no evidence that this is actually a phenomenon that anyone has experienced in this particular part of the Ural Mountains.
It's cold outside, but my pancreas is talking to me. I'm gonna leg it. I'm gone.
It's Evil Dead 4 right there.
Now, I used to live near Dyatlov Pass in Perm, Russia. It's Perm, Perm, if you want to look it up.
Why?
It's a good point.
On purpose?
Yeah. For a decade of my life, I was voluntarily Mormon. Yeah, I know.
Yes, yeah.
I
there you go.
became Mormon as an adult.
See, I'm
from being atheist.
I was a teenager who turned evangelical Christian, so
you're there. Okay,
past, I swear to God.
Yeah. So I understand making this strange mistake.
Yeah, it is. It's a strange mistake. So for 10 years, I was Mormon. 2 of those years, I was a missionary in Russia. And Perm was the first city that I lived in. It was during the summer, which anybody who's lived in Russia in the summer knows it's very, very hot. But it's such a shock when you go to Russia for the first time and it's the middle of the summer and it's extremely hot.
Yeah, honestly, no one's ever told me Russia got hot.
It gets very hot.
I've genuinely never heard that. You just hear
very
about the cold.
intense, short summer, but it's hot. And then the further north you are, the more sun you see. So Perm's pretty far north. But yeah, I did not get to live there in the winter. I know it gets very cold. And Dyatlov is further north by a few hours. So,
right. Like it can only be more miserable.
So very, very, very cold.
Oh no, I don't want to. That's on my list of places of like, no, thank you.
No.
I shall not, thank you. Mark, what season was it when you were in Russia?
The continually pissing it down with rain season, whenever that was. It was just,
spring and fall.
Cold as fuck, and it didn't stop raining one time.
Yep.
A lovely couple of weeks, don't get me wrong, I had a fantastic time out there, but
yeah,
god damn it, did not stop fucking raining, and what a bleak couple of weeks it was.
Yeah.
Where were you?
Oh, Moscow.
Oh, Moscow. Ah, yeah, I've been to Moscow a couple times, and Russia is huge. Like it is so enormous that going to Moscow from I was in the Urals, it was like a culture shock almost. Like it was just sort of a completely different world, but also the exact same world with the exact same people. It was amazing. I really Russia, I don't necessarily recommend it for tourist reasons, but if you go there, gorgeous, people are great.
Sure.
People are great. Okay. Hey,
not all the people. Well, just like in America, not all the people are great.
Anywhere.
They're so similar. The similarities are so ridiculous though, where it's just like stuff you would hear over there would be stuff you would hear in the South over here.
Really?
Yeah, it would just be similar type of thinking. That like if they spoke the same language, they'd be best friends.
I don't know about that, but okay, well, anyways, where was I in talking about these particular Russians? Now that we've talked about the sounds of our organs and whatnot. Okay, so as I was saying, the conspiracies formed around the, injuries that these people had sustained that were not normal to something like an avalanche. So, people want to know, how did this happen? And this is a recent development that has just come out, and National Geographic, as well as many other science publications, were talking about it. So according to the National Geographic article about this, to answer the question of where all these injuries came from, scientists relied on some unorthodox sources of inspiration and information. Johann Gohm explained how a few years back, he was struck by how well the movement of snow was depicted in the 2013 Disney movie Frozen. Okay. So impressed, in fact, that he decided to ask its animators how they pulled it off. So following a trip to Hollywood to meet with the specialists who worked on frozen snow effects, Gohm modified the film's snow animation code for his avalanche simulation models, albeit with decidedly less entertaining purpose, to simulate the impacts that avalanches would have on the human body. So that was part of how that they came up with this, was by using the snow modeling from the film Frozen and modifying the code to make it fit avalanches. But then there's a second source that is unusual to that he mixed with this, or that they mixed with this. So code in hand, they needed realistic values for the forces and pressures the human body could experience in an avalanche. So this time their information came from the automotive industry. We discovered that in the 70s, General Motors took 100 cadavers and broke their ribs, says Alexander Puzrin, hitting them with different weights at different velocities to see what would happen during a car crash. And then that data was ultimately used to calibrate the safety of seatbelts.
I thought this was just like a CEO retreat or something. What? Why did they do this?
For funsies.
And they wrote down the results. At least they did that.
Thankfully, they kept track. Yeah. Some of the cadavers that were used in the GM test were braced with rigid supports while others weren't, a variable which ended up being serendipitous for Puzrin and Gohm. So back on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, the team members had placed their bedding atop their skis. This meant that the avalanche, which hit them as they slept, struck an unusually rigid target, and that the GM cadaver experience from the 70s could be used to calibrate their impact models with remarkable precision.
Oh, phenomenal.
Yeah, so the models demonstrated that a 16-foot-long block of hefty snow could, in this unique situation, handily break the ribs and skulls of people sleeping on a rigid bed. And these injuries would have been severe, but not fatal, at least not immediately. By the way, just as a side about this scientist who's talking about this, the best quote from the article comes from Puzrin, talking about the experience of telling his wife he was working on this case. And Mark, I actually passed this quote to you in Signal. So will you just read that for us?
When I told her that I was working on the Dyatlov mystery for the first time, she looked at me with real respect.
Russian marriage sounds hard.
It does, it really does.
My wife didn't respect me until I started working on this 60-year-old.
She was finally like, oh.
Now she's like, all right, you do have a real job. So, according to these boffins, there's actually kind of a sweet story of friendship here to the Dyatlov Pass mystery. The hikers whose bodies were all broken to shit, they probably couldn't have escaped on their own. So when this avalanche hit, which now they're pretty certain is what happened, it means that the friends who weren't broken likely chose to pull those friends out of the tent rather than take the time to grab their own gear and save their lives by having warm weather clothes to have fled with. So despite them all dying, there is this sort of nice story of friendship to the Dyatlov Pass mystery.
That he tried to save his friends from Bigfoot.
Really nice. Which is the true story of what happened here. Bigfoot pushed the avalanche onto these people. Glad we got to the bottom of that, gang.